This is Block 7, The Greatest Generation, Section 4, Pearl Harbor, with the section that is entitled Pearl Harbor. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was the brainchild of this man. This is Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was obviously Japanese. He was educated in the United States. Well, he went to college in the United States. He went to Harvard. He understood the United States much greater, much better than most anybody else in Japan at the time. He admired the United States, he admired Americans, and he disagreed with his government's belief and of Japan's belief that the United States was soft and that they couldn't possibly fight, a tough people like the Japanese. He was against the operation against Pearl Harbor, but as a good soldier, he takes orders and carries them out to the best of his ability. So Isoroku Yamamoto is the brainchild behind the surprise attack on Pearl. The surprise attack, what would happen was that a fleet of Japanese aircraft carriers would sail up in the stormy northern Pacific Ocean and then dip down towards Hawaii, launch the planes. There was 3 waves of attacks planned, recover the planes, and get out as soon as possible back towards Japan. And what they were aiming for is the United States battle fleet in the Pacific. Japan has a specific goal. Japan's goal, and here's a map of Pearl. Maybe this is doing here. We are working to fix this problem. Please be patient. Here's an aerial map of Pearl Harbor. And these big diamond-looking things over here, these are where the American battleships were. This is called Battleship Row. Japan's strategic goal is to knock out the American battle fleet. When the battle fleet is knocked out, take that time and conquer all of those areas that we saw. The Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, islands of the Pacific, and then sit there and dig in and defend against the inevitable American counterattack. But since they believed the Americans were soft, since they believed that they had the time and wherewithal to dig in, they believed that after the Americans had broken themselves trying to counterattack, the Americans would be forced to the negotiating table. So the attack on Pearl Harbor is a strategic attack, knock out the American fleet so they can conquer these areas in the Pacific and then play defense. The United States had cracked the Japanese naval code. Now, what does that mean? That does not mean that the United States knew everything that was going on in Japan. What it means is the Japanese Navy transmitted, obviously, information by code, radio, over radio waves. Those radio waves could be intercepted, and then those interceptions could be decoded, and then those decoded interceptions would then be translated. Obviously, there's a lot of radio traffic, so you know that analysts never know what is important, what is not important, until it's translated. And obviously, there's only so many people in the United States fluent enough in Japanese to translate. So when you read in a textbook, for example, that the United States had cracked Japan's naval code, this is true, but it does not mean that they knew where an attack was coming, when an attack was coming, how an attack was coming. They knew the Japanese were ready for war. They knew there was an attack coming sometime soon. They believed that the blow would fall in British Malaya or the Philippines. They did not imagine, the United States government did not imagine for a moment that the Japanese had the balls, if you will, to sail into Pearl Harbor and attack it. There was an element of, just like there was racism on the Japanese side towards the United States, they thought that Americans obviously, were soft. There was an element of racism in the American belief that Japan could not possibly be that good, that they weren't a top-of-the-line European-style military because they weren't Europeans. So there's kind of there's attitudes on both sides where there's not a lot of respect afforded to either by the opponent. The United States, therefore, although it knows war is coming, expects it to fall in Malaya or the Philippines, and thus does not get its battleships in readiness formation. It just lines them up side by side. They are more concerned about sabotage by local Japanese on the islands than they are in actual external attack. The airplanes at Ford Field, which is near Pearl Harbor, were not dispersed as they would have been if they were ready for a military-style attack. They were actually brought out into the middle of the runway and clumped close together to guard against sabotage. And this would, of course, make them easy targets for the planes when they came. Japan purposely draws out negotiations to keep the Americans talking while their fleet is on the way to Pearl Harbor. And on Sunday, December the 7th, as people were getting up and getting ready to go to church, in over Oahu, over Pearl Harbor, roared about 150 planes from the Japanese aircraft carriers. Caught the Americans completely and utterly by surprise. Captains were not on their ships, they were on shore. Ammunition was still locked away in locked ammo boxes. Sailors were not at battle stations. It was a complete and utter surprise. The Americans had no planes in the air. An American radar operator had picked up the Japanese fleet coming in, but since they were coming in at approximately the same time, the same place as an American group of bombers was coming into land, this guy didn't think anything of it. The attack is a complete surprise. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers decimate the American fleet. And you can see, here's artists' representations. Here's a Japanese Kate torpedo bomber flying over USS Arizona. Another artist's rendition of, this is a Naval dive bomber. And you can see just the battleships just literally sitting there side by side as the Japanese flew over. If we go back to the map, the ships in red were sunk. The cruiser Detroit, the two destroyers here, a destroyer here, and then 4 of the 8 battleships were sunk. USS California, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, and USS, of course, Arizona. The other 4 battleships were damaged. Not a single battleship emerged unscathed from the attack. The most spectacular of the destroyed battleships was USS Arizona. This is actually a picture. Here's the top of the battleship, and there is the explosion. A bomb penetrated Arizona's deck and exploded in amongst her ammunition, and then all of the ammunition just exploded. It blew the Arizona literally in half, and she just sank straight to the bottom, with over 1,100 sailors inside of her. Another wave comes in to destroy more planes and more ships. By this time, the Americans at least have some planes up in the air, but to their shock and surprise, the American fighter planes are no match for the Japanese fighter planes. The American fighter planes are slower, they are less maneuverable, they are less well armed than the Japanese Zeros, the Japanese fighter planes. The Japanese do not launch a third strike like they were planning on. They figured that the Americans would be more ready for that. So after the second strike and the planes got back to the carriers, the Japanese vamoosed and got out. Over the course of the 90 minutes from the first bomb to the departure of the last, the Americans suffered over 3,000 dead, 188 aircraft were destroyed, all 8 battleships were hit, 2 were sunk permanently, 2 of the 4 that were sunk were eventually raised and were put back into the fleet, and the other 4 were repaired, although some of them did not come back into action for over a year and a half. 7 smaller ships were also sunk, and as we mentioned, USS Arizona. But, as successful tactically as the Japanese attack was, the Japanese were fighting the last war. And they utterly failed in fighting the new war, World War II. Because battleships, as was soon to be seen, excuse me, battleships, as we're soon to be seen, are no longer the most important naval asset. Aircraft carriers are. And the 3 American fleet carriers, like this one, this is USS Lexington, were not in harbor, were not in port. They were out on training missions. They all came back that night, and as these 3 aircraft carriers kind of sailed up amongst the still burning battleships, an entire change in naval warfare, you could see it as the undamaged aircraft carriers sailed in amongst the burning battleships. The Japanese destroy the American battle fleet. Absolutely true. The next day, nothing could have turned the American people towards war like a stab in the back surprise attack. All of a sudden, a country that was 50-50 and very iffy about going to war overwhelmingly desires war. Roosevelt goes to Congress the next day, December the 8th, and in a very famous speech, he calls the attack on Pearl Harbor a day that will live in infamy, and he asks the Congress to declare war on Japan. Congress obliges. The Senate votes unanimously for war. The House, there is only one representative in the House who votes against war. She was Jeanette Rankin, a congresswoman from Montana, who also voted against the entry into World War I. The attack on Pearl Harbor aroused and angered the nation unlike anything else theoretically possibly could have. Hitler and Mussolini, now for a few days the United States is only, they're only going to go to war with Japan. They're not going to go to war with Germany and Italy. Germany and Italy make the United States' job easy, and on December 11th, Hitler and Mussolini declare war on the United States, and Congress responds in kind. But Admiral Yamamoto was right. He had a bead on America a lot better than the other leaders of Japan. And when he got back to Tokyo and was getting all the congratulations of the emperor and everybody else, he said, "I fear that we have awoken a sleeping giant." Because now the United States was united and interested in revenging itself upon Japan.